My name is Mike Hoer. I've lived and worked in mainly Asia for about 30 years. Started my professional career with Arthur Andersen, which later became Accenture. I was in their consulting business. Then I went to Schlumberger, worked in Africa, Europe, and the US, also Asia with Schlumberger. I was stationed in Japan and Singapore with them. In 1989, I was hired by Continental Grain, very large private agribusiness company, and moved to Hong Kong and lived in Hong Kong for another 18 years after that. So we have lived and worked in many of the continents around the world now. Well, let me give you 3 reasons why you might want to consider an international career. I think the first reason is globalization of business. It may be that you have to consider an international career because it's going to become necessary. There are so many businesses that now are not able to exist in their home country or in 1 or 2 countries. You really have to think on a global scale to be more efficient and more effective in your business model. So it could be that even if you don't want to have an international career, in order to progress in your career and in your company, you're going to need to consider that and be willing to go overseas at some point. A second reason, more on personal development and maybe even a selfish reason, is just how great it is to have an international career. We grew up in our house, we had a big map on the wall so that our kids, when they're growing up, they could see that the world was bigger than just their little place where they lived. We lived in Hong Kong at that time when they're growing up, so it was easy to show them, look, this is just a little island at the bottom of China. The whole world is out there waiting for you. And the cultural experiences that you'll have, the growing experiences, the opportunity to learn a language, to think and feel like other people do, that's just an amazing experience that you can't duplicate if you stay home your whole life. A third reason would probably be the ability to make more money, to be promoted more quickly. We can talk about that later. But typically when you're willing to go overseas, especially if other people in your company are not, then you're going to be promoted more quickly. You're going to have a chance to learn and do more things at a younger age, and the financial rewards come along with that as well. A lot of people have some kind of passion. They've either learned a language, maybe they've done service overseas, and so they have this desire to further that experience. And so those type of people, it's a no-brainer. They want to go overseas. They can feel that it's something that they want to broaden their life by doing. If you don't have that feeling and you're saying, you know, I'm completely not passionate about this, you know, maybe it's not for you, but a good way to try and see if you have any interest is to take some baby steps. Get your feet wet a little. Maybe you take a trip to France or someplace in Europe and get the feeling of people speaking a different language and how much that you can learn by making a small trip like that. You probably want to go to someplace a little more safe and normal. Don't go to North Korea on your first trip overseas, but yeah, try something a little more. You're from Canada, you know. You could consider that at your first overseas experience. Maybe you do something like that and see what an amazing place that is. And then you start to realize that each one of these countries has this amazing background, amazing history, and amazing people that you'll be able to experience. So I think that has changed a lot. In the early days, most US companies that were working overseas would hire expatriates. And the reason was because there weren't that many people that spoke the language. There weren't that many people willing to go. I think a lot of that has changed. There are now something like 300,000 Chinese students studying in the US, students who are going to go back and compete for those jobs. There's 1 million foreign students total. I think the second most common country was Saudi Arabia. And so these are individuals who are going to learn Western business style, they're going to learn English, and they're going to be competing for some of the same jobs. However, most companies would rather hire a qualified national in the country. So for example, when I first started working in China, when I was in charge of Continental Grains operations throughout Asia, we had about 12,000 employees in China. And in most of my key management positions, I had an expatriate. Over the space of 18 years, really less than that, it was probably less than 10 years, I had replaced all of those positions with great local individuals, good managers who deserve the chance to be promoted. And so at the end, I was the only expatriate in our company. Everybody else was, they may not have been from China, but they were from Burma, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. But I think there's still a lot of opportunities for expatriates to find positions overseas. Let me just, 3 items come to mind. The first would be flexibility. You really have to have an attitude that people are doing things a different way for a good reason. Too often, the ugly American goes overseas and says, why aren't they doing it this way? You know, that's a stupid way. Nobody does anything anywhere in the world because they're stupid. They do it because they have a good reason. And it's up to us to find out what that good reason is and understand it. So you have to have a flexible mindset. You have to have an open mind, or else you're not going to do well overseas. Closely associated with that, I think, is a second character trait, and that is the ability to communicate. Communication often we think is just talking. Again, as I was trying to point out my first comment of flexibility, communication is a lot about listening and trying to understand. And then, of course, being able to express yourself in a clear, concise way. So communication would be a trait that I think is almost indispensable. And then I think the third trait that comes to mind would be a never give up attitude. Things are much tougher in many cases when you don't speak the language, when you don't know what's going on. And so in the absence of everything else, you've got to have this never say die attitude where you're going to find a way to get things done. I used to tell our managers in China, when a Chinese official tells you, no way, it can't be done, that's just the start of the negotiation. It doesn't mean there's no way. It doesn't mean that you say, oh gosh, I'm sorry, okay. And a lot of people get very frustrated. They can say, why don't they just say what they mean then? But that's not how it's done there. So you have to have this attitude that, you know, I'm going to find another way to get this done. So I just went over and spent 1.5 years in Egypt. I learned Arabic. I'm 64 years old. So if I answered that question, say, yeah, you're too old, then I'd be shooting myself in the head. But no, I don't think there's never an age when you're too old to go overseas and to have a great new experience, to do new things. I mean, when does that become a bad idea? Never. However, let me say this. I think you're right, because you said, you know, when I'm younger, I'm more flexible, I don't have a mortgage payment. You know, there are constraints that happen. I would give one constraint that I think is worth considering. The rest I would refer back to my comment on finding a way to get things done. You can basically solve almost anything else, except maybe when your kids reach about teenage age. in our experience, and we tried to stay put at those formative teenage years, because we recognize it's very tough for a teenager to move, lose their friends, adapt to a new country. That can be difficult. And we actually moved from Hong Kong to the US at one point, and our kids did have a hard time adjusting. They said, I'm a Hong Kong person, I'm not a US person. But I would consider maybe not the age of yourself, but maybe the age of your children as a valid reason to consider other options for dealing in an overseas career, like we could talk about. You can have your office in the States and you can travel, or you can do other things. So you still have an overseas experience, but you leave your kids in a solid setting so that they don't have to do that adjusting. The first is what I call the Green Beret method. So the Green Beret method is the most exciting, it's the most risky, it's probably may or may not give you a lot of financial benefit, but it's going to be a great experience. And the Green Beret method is basically you just go to a country, you start looking for work. I always recommend don't teach English, because that doesn't look good on a business resume. So try to find some job or some occupation, even if it's service work, that you can spin into a business career and a business resume. But the pros of this is that you are going to find jobs that nobody else has access to. So if I go to Poland and I'm working in Warsaw, I'm going to learn about jobs, amazing opportunities that nobody else at the BYU Placement Center is going to know about. So that is one of the biggest advantage. The second big advantage is you just have these amazing experiences. Give you an example. I actually did the Green Beret method in 1979. I was among the first 17 students in the United States to be able to go to China on a study abroad program. After that, in 1982, I got a job, and we just started working at a university. I was asked to set up a business management curriculum. Now, you ask, well, what experience does a 25-year-old have in that? Absolutely none. But I just took all my notes from MBA school and just taught and set up the exact same classes as BYU has. So maybe there's a university in China still using the same books, I don't know. But the opportunity to experience those things is just, it's an amazing experience. Let me give you an example of another young man came and said he'd like to go to China. So he had 2 children, told him about the Green Beret method. He went over to China, he started working, and he said, I couldn't get any job except teaching English. And you told me not to do that, so at least I found a job teaching business English. He was a little bit discouraged, things weren't going that well. Well, one day the manager of the company came to him and said, look, we need to make a business presentation. Could you help us do this? Because we don't know how to do it in English. So he helped them put together this presentation. They talked a little bit about negotiating strategy, and they were so excited, they said, look, if we get any business from this presentation, we'll give you 1% of the revenue. So he said, great, that sounds good. They went over, made the presentation. Their first order was $6 million, and the company that they were presenting to was Walmart. So you can do the math. That turned out to be a Green Beret experience that ended up being very lucrative, because 6 months later they put in another order, and every half year they put in another order. So he's doing very well. Again, an experience that a lot of times you just fall into, but you have those if you're on a Green Beret track. So the second method, and I call this more traditional method, is you graduate from school, you go to a good company that you can see has an international footprint. They're willing to send you overseas. You let them know that the reason you're joining their company is because your hand is up, you're ready to go to Albania. You know, I've always wanted to go to Albania. I know you have business there. I know you make products there. You're trying to expand. I'm the guy that wants to go. But what you do is you work there for a couple of years. You show them that you're the trusted employee. Nowadays, companies send trusted employees overseas. It's a little bit more difficult to send an untrusted, brand new rookie overseas, especially with a significant financial package. But once you become the trusted employee, and they need somebody that's going to uphold the company values, the company culture, knows the people back in the United States so it can communicate in an easy, smooth way and get answers and do the business, then that is the type of trusted individual that they want to send overseas. After a couple of years, you become that person, then you can go overseas. Now, the advantage to this is obvious. This is much better for families. The company is now going to pay for all your kids to go to school. They're going to pay a home leave. They're probably going to give you a membership to a business club or something in your wherever you're living. So this tends to be a more lucrative financial proposition. Also, it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can come back after a couple of years if you find out the family is not adjusting. So there, you can turn this into other opportunities, but this is really the traditional way of having an international career. The third way, which is becoming a lot more common now, is you can live in the United States or your home country and commute. I call this the frequent flyer way. So the third method is the frequent flyer way, and I've done this. I did this for 6 years. I went back and forth from Hong Kong every 2 to 3 weeks. I have 1.5 million miles on a couple of airlines. And you can do this now because communications are so easy. You can do video conferencing. You can, everybody has some electronic way to communicate very simply at the drop of a hat. And so you can have your office in the US, but spend a lot of time traveling in the country or doing business from the US in the country. So this is maybe an option for, like what we were just talking about, for families with older children. They don't want to move the whole family, but the spouse or the worker in the family can see that this is a great way to further his or her career, to have an international experience, and yet still remain home-based. So you kind of have the best of both worlds. The last, or the fourth way, which I'm very excited about, because I think as the opportunity for rookie job placement overseas, that window is closing a little bit, maybe more competitive because so many international students are in the same space. If you look at the fourth method, I call this the home country expert. When international companies, and we just talked about the international companies need to be more global now. So you have a lot of international companies that are coming to the US, and let's say that your expertise, your home country is the US. You then become the expert on US opportunities. I had a friend of mine who said, look, I want to hire an MBA student. I want him to be male, and I want him to be 25 years old, and he's just going to go around and help our CEO with investment decisions. Because we want to make sure that our CEO, he has somebody that knows finance, but more importantly, he has somebody that can teach him US and Western culture so he doesn't make any cultural mistakes. And I said, well, I'm very sorry. I've got to tell you right off, you can't advertise just for a male. You can't advertise just for somebody 25 years old, because you're going to be sued for gender discrimination, age discrimination. And he said, that's why we need this guy. See, we're going to make all those mistakes unless we have him. So this was a brand new rookie job, 6 figures, and a great opportunity to have an international career right here in the US, because you're going to be working with this guy day in and day out. You're going to learn the culture, and eventually many of these opportunities lead to a chance to go back to the foreign country. One of the advantages about this is that most of these companies that are looking for these kind of jobs, even Lenovo, I helped Lenovo set up some interviews here at Brigham Young University, which they hadn't considered before. They didn't realize there were so many people that spoke foreign languages here. Well, when they came here, they were so excited. Out of the 6 hires that they were going to do clear around the United States, they hired 3 from BYU. So most companies are not like Lenovo, though. They don't know about placement centers. They don't know how to get in. And even Lenovo at the time wasn't really sure exactly how to do it. BYU did a great job at the last minute to accommodate them. But most of these companies, you can find them and there'll be no competition for the job. I was just on the East Coast talking to a friend of mine who has several companies that supply Stanley Black & Decker. And I said, where are you going to build your next factory? This is a Chinese executive. And I thought he might say Chongqing or Sichuan, inland China somewhere where the costs are a little lower. He said, South Carolina, closer to our shipping market. We have a tax benefit. The costs in China are higher now. These costs are basically the same or lower. So this is a guy who's going to build a company in South Carolina, supply Stanley Black & Decker, doesn't even speak English. He's going to need people like those of you that are watching to go and be his right-hand man or work in the company. Why? Because you know how to do business in America and he doesn't. I sit on the board right now of a company. It's a Taiwanese company, great company, and such high integrity, great people. But the tough question that I got just a while ago was, should we send out Thanksgiving cards or Christmas cards? Because we know that, Thanksgiving is important and Christmas is important. What should we do? Well, anybody could make, so you could do my job right now. Those are the kind of things, and I'm being a little facetious, but when you go to a foreign country, you need a local country expert, and that is a great way to have an international career, never leaving your home country if you want, but usually leading to an opportunity to go overseas at some point. Oh, it's different in every country, and that's the beauty of it. I love to learn a little language in every country. I love to try to find out as much as I can about the culture. And by the way, if you don't know the language, if you can learn the culture, that is a huge advantage. We had a head of our company, Mr. Don Staley, didn't speak a word of any foreign language, but really was a student of culture. And we went to Thailand. He met with the Queen of Thailand, and she was so impressed with the fact that, he didn't reach out, hey, shake hands, he knew Sawati Krap. He knew the culture. He knew you don't touch the head. You don't point your feet at certain holy objects in the temples and so forth. She was so impressed with his cultural ability that she gave Continental Grain the sole rice trading rights for 1 decade. So incredible. You don't necessarily have to speak the language, but culture is important in any circumstance. So I'm not sure our children realized what an amazing experience they were having when they were growing up. And I remember one time we were on a vacation and we were held up at gunpoint, and my son said, we shouldn't call these family vacations, Dad, we should call them family ordeals. And there's a little bit of truth to that, because we really did take our kids to some non-vacation spots that I think at the time they may not have appreciated so much. But when you talk to them now and when they reach their upper teenage years, not a day goes by where they don't say, oh, that was the greatest experience of our lives. We learned so much. They all want to have international careers because of those experiences. The world is such a bigger place. And I think children, they recognize that and they're grateful for that. It's important to make sure they're having a good experience. So maybe you don't want to do too many of the family ordeals, but there's just some amazing things that they can learn and they can grow from. And very quickly, when they start associating with their peers and when they go to college, they're going to realize that the way they grew up is very different from many of their peers, and the opportunities that they had growing up are so much more fuller and so much more rich that they really do appreciate that. So let me give you an example of what type of opportunities you might have if you're overseas to more quickly further your career, because we talked about that was one of the advantages. So we had a company, and I won't mention the name or anything, but there was a company in China, and the president of the company was accused of sexual harassment, and we had to let him go. So we had to find a president of this company, a new president of the company. This company is a joint venture between a US company, Fortune 100, and a Chinese company. And the US company has the right to put in the president. So this was an issue where the US company, very much feeling out of their element in China, was now having to pick a president. So it boiled down to two candidates. They had one Chinese manager who was already working in the company, worked there for 17 years, of course spoke Chinese, expert at manufacturing, which is what the company did. And then they had a second candidate, 29-year-old Irishman, who only worked in China a couple of years, never done manufacturing. He came from an engineering background, which is great, but not necessarily what they needed in that role. The US company chose the Irishman for the role of president. So I was talking to the CEO and I said, if we were in Indiana, would you take a Chinese person who had never worked in America before, didn't really speak the language, never had manufacturing experience, and make them president of your Indiana company? He said, no, of course, we'd never do that. But in China, it's different. We need somebody who's not going to embarrass us. We need the trusted individual. So here's a 29-year-old who is now president of a significant Chinese company. Would he have been able to do that in Ireland? I don't think so. In my own career, I had a similar experience. I was doing consulting for Schlumberger. They had an internal consulting group. We went to a company in Japan. I gave a report and I said, these are all the things we need to do. Usually I would make my presentation and I'm off to the next project. Well, the CEO of Schlumberger said, Mike, will those suggestions work? And I said, yes, sir. Of course they will. He said, get on the next plane and you are the CFO now of the Japanese company. He also kicked out the CEO. So the two of us went over and had to completely rebuild this company from scratch. A lot of structural and personnel changes. But basically, at the young age of, how old was I then? About, not 30 yet. Here I am, the number 2 guy in this company, and we're redoing the entire company. And needless to say, it was very rewarding financially as well, and was a stepping stone to other positions later in my career. I then went on to be the head of finances in all of Asia Pacific because I had done a good job in Japan. So I don't think, as much as I like to think I can do a good job and I'm very talented and smart, certainly being overseas jump-started my career in a way that I could have never jump-started in the States.